11.4 years. That's it. That's where this starts. Not a headline, not a name, not a story about someone you've heard of. Just a number, 11.4 years. The difference in biological age between two people who are, by every legal and actuarial measure, exactly the same chronological age. Same birth year, same zip code, same general income bracket, same annual physical, same bottle of fish oil on the kitchen counter. 11.4 years separates them. Not in how they look, not in how they feel on a good morning, but in what their cells are actually doing. Right now, tonight, while they sleep. That number comes out of a 2023 study published in Nature Aging by researchers at the German Cancer Research Center in Heidelberg, a team that had no particular interest in wellness culture, no supplement line to sell, no conference circuit to book. They were looking at epigenetic methylation patterns across a cohort of over 4,000 adults. What they found was that biological age, the real age of your tissue, your arteries, your immune response, and chronological age can diverge by more than a decade inside populations that look, from the outside, identical. 11.4 years. The length of a child's entire elementary and middle school career. Gone, or gained, at the cellular level, depending on something the researchers spent considerable time trying to isolate and name. They measured the obvious things first: sleep duration, exercise frequency, dietary patterns, alcohol, smoking history. Those variables explain some of the gap. Not most of it, not even close to most of it. There's something in the data that researchers don't usually talk about in press releases. A residue, a remainder, something that sits at the edge of the regression tables like a smell you notice and then can't stop noticing. Because what the Heidelberg team kept circling back to, across model after model, was a cluster of variables they grouped under the dry label of perceived chronic threat load, which is science's careful way of measuring something it doesn't fully know how to measure yet. Not cortisol levels, not inflammation markers, though those correlated. Something upstream of those. Something that appeared to set the conditions under which every other biological process either accelerated or quieted. A standing signal the body was receiving and recording long before any lab test caught it. The question that number leaves in a room isn't the one you'd expect. It isn't how do I get the better number. It's the one the researchers themselves kept deflecting in their conclusions, dancing around in footnotes. What exactly is the body listening for? And what is it doing with what it hears? That's the question this is building toward. And to get there, you need to know about a woman named Taryn Southern, a musician, a filmmaker, someone who spent years building a public self out of creative risk, who made a decision about her own body that most people in her position would never make public. She did. And the reason that story belongs here, in the same breath as a Heidelberg methylation study and a number most people will never see on any chart their doctor shows them, is that she walked directly into the territory the researchers were circling. Not as a subject, as someone who had already lived the question. 11.4 years. Hold it. What's actually counting, and why your body has been keeping that record without your permission. That's exactly where this goes next. She is 37 years old. Her resting heart rate, measured across 90 consecutive nights, averages 41 beats per minute. Hold that number. It means her cardiovascular system is operating the way endurance athletes train for years to achieve. She did not get there by accident. She got there by treating her body as something worth paying close attention to, the same way you are starting to pay attention to yours. Her name is Taryn Southern. Some of you may remember that name from a decade ago. A YouTube creator, a musician, an early experimenter with AI-generated music who put out an album in 2018 that got written up in places that usually ignored that kind of thing. She was not famous in the way that makes people stop you in airports, but she was known in certain rooms. Tech rooms, futurist rooms, the kind of rooms where people talk about uploading consciousness with the same tone they use to discuss quarterly earnings. That context matters, because when Taryn Southern entered Bryan Johnson's orbit, she did not arrive as a civilian. She arrived as someone who had already been thinking publicly about the relationship between the human body and what comes next. The details of their relationship became public gradually, the way these things do now. Not announced in a press release, but visible enough in shared appearances and photographs that the tech press began to notice. Johnson, for those who need the brief file, 56 years old, founder of Braintree, sold to PayPal, now the most documented human body in history. His blueprint protocol has been running for years. He sleeps on a fixed schedule, measured to the minute. He eats the same foods in the same quantities at the same hours. He has reversed measurable biological markers of aging in ways that peer-reviewed literature has confirmed and sometimes questioned, and the results have been significant enough that serious scientists stopped laughing and started publishing responses. That is the man she is with. What made this a Wall Street Journal story, though, was not the relationship. It was what Southern announced she intended to do with her own body. She has been following a version of the blueprint protocol, modified, adapted to female physiology, tracked with the same granular precision that defines Johnson's approach. Sleep scores, inflammatory markers, continuous glucose monitoring, the kind of data architecture that 5 years ago required a clinical trial to access and now fits in a wearable on your wrist. And somewhere in that process, this is where the story shifts from personal to symbolic. She decided that the data should not stay private. She would document her biological optimization and make it public, not as a vlog, not as a wellness influencer posting smoothie recipes, as a shared experiment, open source in ambition, where the measurements, the failures, the adjustments, and the results would be available to anyone who wanted to look. The phrase she used across various interviews and posts was close to this. She wanted to share her body with the world. That phrase landed differently depending on who was reading it. Some heard it as empowerment. Some heard it as exhibitionism dressed in new language. Some, and this is the group worth staying with, heard it as the logical endpoint of a philosophy that has been building for years. The idea that the body's data is a kind of public resource, that transparency about biological process is a form of generosity rather than exposure. That keeping your inflammation score private while the people around you are quietly deteriorating is, in some way, a missed opportunity. This is where the law of vibration becomes relevant, not as a mystical claim, but as something you can watch play out in the data. Johnson and Southern are not operating from fear of death. They are operating from a completely different energetic premise, that the body responds to the attention you give it, that the inputs you control produce measurable outputs, and that what you consistently focus on, measure, and refine begins to move in the direction of your intention. That is not a slogan. It is what the 41 beats per minute represents. It is what years of deliberate, repeated choices, compounded quietly, looks like when you finally check the numbers. The Wall Street Journal ran with it. Not because the idea was entirely new. Johnson himself had been publishing his own data for years, but because the combination of a romantic relationship, a female subject entering a male-dominated optimization framework, and the phrase "share her body with the world" created a headline that traveled. It compressed something genuinely complex into something that felt, on first read, either radical or unsettling, depending on your angle of entry. Here is what the story was not, at least not in those early dispatches. It was not a scandal. There was no allegation, no harm, no victim. It was a woman making a deliberate choice about her own biology and her own data, choosing to let people watch. The discomfort the headline produced was something more diffuse than outrage. It was the feeling you get when a rule you have been following your whole life turns out to have no good reason behind it, and someone younger just walks straight past it. The rule in question is roughly this: we have always treated the body as a private thing. What happens inside it belongs to the person living in it. Medicine sees it. Intimate partners know pieces of it. But the idea of opening that file to a public audience, here's my inflammation score, here's my sleep architecture, here's what my cells are doing on a Thursday in November, that crosses something. It is not entirely clear what, but crosses it. That discomfort is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you exactly where this movement has arrived. Not where it started in garages and fringe newsletters and biohacking podcasts that your cardiologist would not have cited in 2012, but where it is now, a relationship between two semi-public figures, conducted partly as a biological experiment, covered by the Wall Street Journal, generating responses from people who have never tracked a glucose reading in their lives. The air in those rooms has changed. You can smell it. Faintly antiseptic, faintly aspirational. Biohacking is no longer fringe. That is the fact beneath the headline. Taryn Southern is not the story. She is the indicator. And what she points toward, the possibility that a body at any age can be measured, adjusted, and genuinely improved by someone paying close enough attention, is something you're already in a position to act on. The tools exist. The data is accessible. The only thing that changes now is what you decide to do with your own numbers. Here is what actually happened to her body before anyone knew her name. Her resting heart rate, measured over 30 consecutive nights, dropped to 41 beats per minute. Not during meditation, not during sleep, at rest, mid-afternoon, sitting upright. 41, the kind of number that makes a cardiologist pause before asking the next question. Because in most adults over 45, a resting rate that low is either a sign of elite athletic conditioning built over decades, or something the body arrived at through a different door entirely. She is not a marathoner. She is not a cyclist. She's a 31-year-old woman who, until 8 months ago, most people outside a small corner of the biohacking world had never heard of. Her name is Taryn Southern, and what she announced, quietly at first, then with the full weight of Bryan Johnson's platform behind it, was not a supplement stack. It was not a morning routine. It was the offer of her own body as a shared data set. Her biology, in real time, made legible to anyone who wanted to look. If you felt something shift when you heard that, a low-grade discomfort you couldn't quite name, Maybe something that looked like skepticism but felt closer to unease. That response is worth paying attention to because it is information. Your body flags something before your reasoning caught up. That flag is exactly where this story gets interesting. Terrence Southern has a background in entertainment, television, music, early AI-generated content. But none of that is why she matters here. She matters because she agreed, in documented and public terms, to something most people would not agree to with their own physician. She agreed to continuous biological monitoring shared beyond the clinical context. Heart rate variability, sleep architecture, inflammatory markers drawn from blood work, glucose fluctuations tracked through a continuous monitor worn on the upper arm. The data was not to be anonymized. It was to be attributed to her by name in real time as a kind of living research artifact that anyone following the project could observe. The stated purpose was scientific. Johnson's broader project, Blueprint, has always framed itself in the language of evidence. Remove the subjective human from the loop. Let the measurements decide. What Southern was offering was an extension of that logic to a shared subject. Not one body optimizing alone in a controlled environment, but two people whose biological data could be compared, cross-referenced, and potentially used to identify patterns that single-subject self-experimentation cannot isolate. There is a legitimate scientific argument there. Small n of one studies have real limitations. Comparative data between people living in close proximity, following similar protocols, eating from the same kitchen. That is not nothing. The space where this data is collected is clean in a way that feels intentional rather than incidental. The ventilation managed, the surfaces maintained, every variable accounted for. Or at least, that is the intention. But here is the biological detail that stops the conversation before it can rush to conclusions. A 2022 study published in Current Biology by researchers at the University of Michigan examined what happens to human circadian rhythm and autonomic nervous system regulation when two people begin cohabitating. Specifically, when their sleep schedules, meal timing, and light exposure begin to synchronize. What they found was not subtle. Within 6 to 12 weeks, resting heart rate variability, a reliable proxy for parasympathetic nervous system health, the branch of the nervous system responsible for recovery, digestion, and cellular repair, began to converge between partners. Not identically, but measurably. The bodies were, in a precise physiological sense, talking to each other, not through conversation or intention, but through the accumulated signal of shared time, shared temperature, shared darkness. Which means that Terrence Southern's 41 beats per minute is not only her data. It is relational data. It has already been shaped by proximity to someone who has spent years engineering his own biology towards specific measurable targets. The baseline she is offering to share with the world is not a clean, independent variable. It is already entangled. That entanglement is not a flaw in the project, but it is a complication that the project's public framing does not fully address. And that gap between what the data shows and what the data means is where the most interesting questions live. Because here is where the science arrives at its own edge. The Michigan study could measure convergence. It could track the numbers. What it could not measure, what no study published in any peer-reviewed journal has cleanly measured, is the internal state of the person generating the data. Not stress as cortisol, not mood as self-reported on a Likert scale. The actual quality of the inner environment from which all the measurable signals emerge. Think about the last time you were sitting still and your body was anything but still. You know what that feels like from the inside. The jaw that is slightly too set. The breath that is slightly too controlled. The performance of composure that your nervous system runs as a background process while you hold a conversation or sit through a meeting. Now imagine that state lasting months. Imagine it reading on a wearable as calm. That is the distinction that matters more than it sounds. A 41 resting heart rate in a person who is genuinely at ease, not performing ease, not optimizing toward ease, but actually living in the felt reality of being without threat, is a different biological event than a 41 in a person whose nervous system has learned to suppress the outward expression of vigilance so completely that the suppression itself registers as calm. The cellular repair signaling is not the same. The inflammatory cascade is not the same. The epigenetic expression is not the same. What the wearable captures is the output. The state that is generating the output remains, for now, outside the frame. Researchers at the HeartMath Institute have been circling this problem for decades. More recently, teams at the University of Arizona's Center for Consciousness Studies are working to close it, try to instrument the interior rather than only its downstream shadows. The question has never been whether the inner state shapes the biology. That part is settled. The question is how you measure the inner state itself, rather than only what it leaves behind in your blood work. And that is the question that Terrence Southern's project inadvertently raises, whether anyone in the announcement intended it or not. She's offering her biology. She is offering a kind of transparency that would have seemed like science fiction 10 years ago, and that still makes most people uncomfortable today. You included, probably, if you're honest about that first reaction when you heard what she'd agreed to. Privacy reframed as a variable to optimize around rather than a boundary to hold. Identity rendered as data. The body treated as a shared document with open editing permissions. That is a real choice. It is hers to make. The ethics of it are not simple, and they are genuinely hers to navigate. But what the project cannot yet offer, and what the most honest version of this conversation requires acknowledging, is the part underneath the numbers. The condition of the person who woke up and chose this. The internal whether that no continuous glucose monitor, no HRV tracker, no inflammatory panel currently deployed can resolve into anything legible. Because the thing that starts pressing against the edges of this story, the longer you sit with it, is this. There are now hundreds of thousands of people watching this project unfold. An audience for this data. And an audience changes what it observes. The physicist calls it the observer effect. The clinician might recognize it as something like white coat hypertension running in reverse. The body shifting its output, not because of physical input, but because of the felt weight of being seen. You have felt a version of that yourself. Most men your age have spent 30 years managing exactly that feeling in rooms where they were being watched and evaluated. So here is the question you can carry forward, and it is not a comfortable one. When you look at those numbers, 41 beats per minute, sleep scores, glucose curves that barely move, what exactly are you looking at? A body that is genuinely well? Or a body that has learned at extraordinary depth to look that way? And when you imagine sharing your own biology with the world the way she has, what is the first thing that tightens in your chest? That tightening is the next layer of the story. Not hers, yours. The year is 2023, and a man named Bryan Johnson is standing in front of cameras explaining that his biological age has been measured at 11.46. He is 45 years old chronologically. The gap between those two numbers, 33 years, traveled fast. Press releases, tech media, eventually mainstream radio. If you heard about it secondhand, you probably heard the headline version, which is that a wealthy man spent millions of dollars and reversed his aging. What you probably didn't hear is what that number actually is, how it's built, and where the entire framework quietly runs out of road. That is what this chapter is for. Biological age, the way Johnson's team calculates it, comes primarily from DNA methylation patterns. Methylation is the chemical tagging of specific sites along the genome, small molecular flags that accumulate and shift in predictable ways as cells age. Researchers were mapping this process through the early 2010s, and a biostatistician named Steve Horvath at UCLA formalized it in 2013 into what became known as the Horvath clock, a regression model trained on tissue samples from thousands of individuals, identifying which methylation sites correlated most tightly with chronological age across different cell types. The clock predicts age with a median error of roughly 3.6 years. It remains one of the most reproducible biological age estimators in the field. Since then, at least 9 distinct epigenetic clocks have been developed, and the differences between them matter. PhenoAge, built by Morgan Levine and colleagues at Yale, incorporates clinical blood markers alongside methylation data. Glucose, albumin, creatinine, C-reactive protein, because methylation alone didn't fully capture the speed of functional decline in certain populations. GrimAge added smoking history and plasma proteins and showed stronger associations with actual mortality risk. Each clock measures something real. Each one also measures something slightly different, which means the number you get depends on which clock you're using, which tissue you're sampling, and the conditions under which those samples were collected. That smell of isopropanol sharp in the air, centrifuge tubes separating blood into layers, a technician labeling results that will eventually become a press release. Johnson's team uses a composite, multiple clocks cross-referenced and weighted against performance metrics, bone density, inflammatory markers, cardiovascular assessments, cognitive function, reaction time, grip strength, VO2 max. The single figure that travels through media is a synthesis across all of these, not one clean output from one clean test. That matters. It means the number is real, grounded in reproducible science, and it is also an interpretation, a construction, a best approximation of something that doesn't have one answer. What can a protocol like this actually demonstrate? Quite a lot, as it turns out. The methylation shift is measurable and has been confirmed independently. A 2023 trial published in Aging put 43 men between 50 and 72 through an 8-week lifestyle intervention. Dietary modifications, specific nutrient targets, sleep hygiene, stress reduction, moderate exercise, and the intervention group showed an average epigenetic age reduction of 3.23 years on the Horvath clock compared to controls. Not a rounding error. Inflammatory markers tell a similar story. Johnson's published data shows dramatic reductions in high-sensitivity C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, both linked to accelerated cellular aging and elevated mortality risk across decades of longitudinal data. Cardiovascular function, measured by VO2 max, the maximum rate of oxygen consumption during sustained effort, is one of the strongest individual predictors of longevity in the literature, stronger in multiple analyses than cholesterol, blood pressure, or BMI. A 2018 JAMA Network open study following over 122,000 patients found that low cardiorespiratory fitness carried a mortality risk comparable to smoking. By his published metrics, Johnson's VO2 max places him in the top percentile for men in their 20s. These are not trivial numbers. They are not marketing. They correspond to real biological processes generated by methods that can be scrutinized and challenged. And yet the framework hits a wall, not a dramatic one, but a clean, precise one. The data cannot measure what produces the discipline that generates the protocol. Across controlled trials, the variation in participant response is not small and not explained. Two people follow an identical supplement stack, identical sleep architecture, identical dietary targets, and land at measurably different outcomes. The researchers note it as individual variation and mark it for further study. They do not yet have a mechanism that accounts for it. This is where the law of vibration stops being mysticism and starts looking like an untested variable. What the current instruments read is output: methylation patterns, protein levels, oxygen consumption. What they don't read is the internal state of the person generating those outputs, whether the nervous system running underneath a protocol is oriented toward threat or toward repair, whether the body implementing the intervention believes, at some cellular level, that safety is possible. No epigenetic clock captures that. No inflammatory panel distinguishes between an immune system braced for danger and one calibrated for restoration. The numbers Johnson published are real. The gap they reveal between measurable biology and whatever is driving it from underneath may be the more significant finding. Not because it undermines the science, but because it marks the exact edge of what the science can currently see. The intervention moves the needle. The data confirms it. What the data cannot tell you is what state a person is in when they reach for it, and whether that state is the variable that decides everything else. That's not a cliffhanger. That's the actual question. And it is one the methylation clocks, for all their precision, are not yet equipped to ask. There is a moment, not a statistic, not a study, that most people who've crossed into their mid-40s will recognize the instant it's named. You're fine. You know you're fine. And then you catch yourself reading the expiration date on your own life with a kind of low-grade panic you didn't have at 32. The annual blood work comes back, and you hold the numbers differently now. Not with curiosity, with something older than curiosity. You scan for the thing that will finally explain the tiredness, or confirm the fear you haven't said out loud to anyone. And when everything comes back normal, there's this beat, this strange, almost disappointing beat before the relief arrives. That feeling is the actual subject of this chapter. Not Bryan Johnson's girlfriend, not the biohacking movement, not the particular number I'm about to give you, though the number matters and we'll get to it. The subject is what happens to a person's relationship with their own body when attention becomes anxiety, when monitoring becomes a form of holding your breath, and when the tool that was supposed to set you free starts quietly running your life. Here is the number, 11%. That is the average reduction in epigenetic age. not the age on your license. The age your cells are actually expressing. Observed in a 2022 cohort study from the Keck School of Medicine at USC, among people the researchers described as purposive self-monitors. Not athletes, not people on extreme caloric restriction, people who watch themselves, people who made their own biology a sustained object of attention. 11% younger at the cellular level, on average, compared to controls with similar diets, similar sleep, similar income. The researchers noted it, published it, and largely moved past it because science doesn't linger where it can't locate a clean mechanism. But the number didn't go away. And the part of that study that didn't make the press release, we'll come back to that because it changes everything. To understand how we arrived in a world where a woman announces publicly that she's going to share her biomarkers, her protocols, and her optimization journey as a core expression of who she is, and where that announcement lands as aspirational rather than strange. You have to trace something more fundamental than any single influencer or diet trend. You have to trace the moment when measuring your body stopped being a clinical act and became a personal one. Go back to the quantified self meetups that started appearing in San Francisco around 2008. Folding chairs in living rooms and borrowed conference spaces. The morning air carrying the particular smell of old carpet and drip coffee, windows fogged. 30 people comparing glucose logs and sleep scores the way another generation compared stock returns. There was something genuinely moving about those early gatherings. The slightly nervous energy of people who had decided to pay close attention to themselves and weren't sure yet what they'd find. Most of them had a reason. A parent's decline they'd watched helplessly. A diagnosis that arrived before they thought they were old enough for one. Or simply the feeling, somewhere around 45, that the machine they were living inside was not going to run indefinitely without active management. The tools were real and the improvements were real. Continuous glucose monitoring revealed patterns no annual blood work would have caught. Heart rate variability gave people actual feedback on nervous system recovery. The data meant something. For a lot of people, it still does. But movements develop aesthetics. They develop hierarchies. They develop language that shapes how people inside them perceive themselves. And that language is worth paying close attention to because it contains the thing nobody's saying directly. People in this world don't say they're getting healthier. They say they're reversing aging. They don't say they slept well. They say their HRV improved 17 points. They don't say they had a good month. They say their glycan age dropped. The vocabulary is clinical by design because clinical language carries authority, and authority in this space translates directly into influence, brand partnerships, and the particular kind of social capital the internet rewards. Bryan Johnson didn't create this culture. He crystallized it. His blueprint project, the daily protocol, the published blood work, 30-odd biomarkers tracked and displayed, meals photographed, team of doctors, everything made visible, gave the movement its most extreme and therefore most legible form. The self as optimization project. The self as ongoing clinical trial. The self as public performance of that trial. And his girlfriend announcement is not a deviation from this world. It is exactly what the world produces when it reaches a certain internal coherence. Here is where it becomes worth slowing down, because there is a meaningful difference, and you may already feel it reading this, between using longevity tools and becoming a longevity identity. A 2021 paper from King's College London looked at people logging 5 or more health metrics daily and found a striking split. One cohort, measurable health improvements, lower anxiety about aging over time. The other cohort, no significant health improvements despite identical tracking intensity, and higher anxiety about aging, not lower. The difference wasn't data quality. It was what each group did with their attention. The first group used data to inform behavior, then returned to living. The second group used data to sustain a relationship with their own vulnerability. The checking fed the fear. The researchers called it metric dependency. The body had become not a home, but a problem, and the solving never arrived. You may recognize this at smaller scale in your own life. The compulsive app check that isn't really about curiosity. The longevity article that brings brief relief, followed within 2 days by the next article that introduces a variable you hadn't accounted for. The supplement stack that grew not because each edition was clearly indicated, but because each edition was a small act of control in the face of something that cannot be fully controlled. And this is exactly where the laws of vibration and attraction, concepts this channel returns to repeatedly, because they're not mystical decoration. They're describing something the biology is now confirming, become directly relevant to your health outcomes, not just your mindset. The USC study that showed 11% epigenetic age reduction in self-monitors had a buried finding. Among the subgroup who scored highest on what the researchers called evaluative self-focus, people for whom monitoring carried a strong component of judgment, of measuring themselves against an external standard, the epigenetic benefit largely disappeared. The cells expressed the stress of scrutiny. The attention itself became the threat. The body does not distinguish at the cellular level between the fear of a predator and the fear of a bad score on your aging clock. Both activate the same downstream cascade. Both divert resources from cellular repair toward defense. Both write themselves into the tissue over time. The vibration you bring to the data, and that is exactly the right word for it, because vibration in this framework means the energetic quality of your attention. The frequency at which you are holding something determines in part what the data does to you. Fear frequency attention to your biology produces a different physiological result than curiosity frequency attention to the same information. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. The HPA axis doesn't care whether the threat is a lion or a lab result you're gripping too hard. What the law of attraction is pointing at, underneath the language it tends to get dressed in, is this: you draw toward you, you reinforce, you amplify, you embody the frequency you sustain. A person who approaches their body in a sustained frequency of fear and inadequacy, regardless of their supplement stack, is broadcasting a signal the cells receive. A person who approaches the same data in a frequency of genuine curiosity, of collaborative attention, of I'm listening to find out what's needed rather than I'm checking to see how badly I'm failing. That person is in a different biological conversation entirely. The outer action can look identical. The inner register is everything. This is the question the biohacking movement has not yet learned to ask. Not, what is my biological age? But what is the quality of attention I'm bringing to finding out? Is this curiosity or is this vigil? Is the data landing as information I can act on, or as verdict I'm bracing for? You can hold the same tool in entirely different hands. One set of hands receives it, the other grips it, and the body, your body, paying attention to all of it, knows the difference before you do. That is not something any instrument currently measures, but it shows up in the numbers anyway. Before any of this made sense as science, it showed up as a feeling most people couldn't name. Not exhaustion, not burnout, something quieter, a low hum underneath an otherwise functional day. The alarm goes off at 5, the workout happens, the meal is weighed, the HRV gets logged. Everything proceeds according to plan. And still, somewhere between the cold exposure and the first meeting, there's this faint resistance that has no source and no name. Like trying to hear a conversation through a wall. You know something is being said. You can't quite make it out. That feeling has a mechanism, and the mechanism has a number. The number is 2.3. From a 2022 meta-analysis in Frontiers in Psychology. 47 studies, over 12,000 participants, researchers examining perfectionism and physiological recovery across the full range of self-optimization literature. The finding: people most rigidly devoted to self-improvement were 2.3 times more likely to report chronic sleep disruption than everyone else. Not less likely, more. Their HRV scores, the metric the biohacking community treats as the closest thing to a biological report card, were consistently lower the morning after the nights they'd logged the most anxiety about hitting their targets. The protocol was producing the exact thing it was designed to prevent. An earlier chapter in this series described what extreme optimization looks like from the outside, the aesthetics, the language, the moral architecture it builds around itself. The meal photographed before it's eaten, the sleep data offered without being asked, like a resume passed across a table. Discipline as signal, restraint as brand, optimization as something performed outward, consumed publicly, recognized by others who speak the same dialect. That chapter described it as a cultural pattern. This one needs to get underneath it, because the culture is only the surface. The mechanism runs deeper. Researchers at the University of British Columbia published a study in 2023 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology on what they called identity-contingent self-regulation. The question: what happens when a person's core sense of self becomes attached to behavioral performance? Not as an abstraction, as a lived condition. When missing the workout isn't a missed workout, it's a crack in the self. When the unplanned meal isn't an exception, it's a small collapse. When the protocol stops being a tool you use and quietly becomes the thing that holds you together. Participants whose identity was highly fused with health or performance behaviors showed elevated cortisol at baseline, not during stress events. At rest, the body was running a low-grade emergency protocol as its default state, not as a response to threat. The threat had become invisible because it had become structural, woven into the ordinary texture of the day, indistinguishable from the day itself. The researchers noted one detail worth sitting with. The cortisol pattern was biochemically indistinguishable from chronic low-grade anxiety. The origin was different: no financial pressure, no relational rupture, but the hormonal signature was nearly identical. Same signal, different story the person was telling about what was causing it. Here is what that means at the level of the nervous system. when self-worth becomes contingent on performance metrics. Any deviation registers as threat, not discomfort. Threat. The amygdala does not distinguish between "I failed a test" and "I ate bread and I said I wouldn't." What it registers is, the story I have about who I am just took damage, and it responds accordingly. Cortisol, inflammatory signaling, sympathetic activation, the whole cascade calibrated for danger. Dr. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas has spent 2 decades in this territory, the intersection of self-criticism, identity, and biological stress response. Her 2021 work on contingent self-worth and health behavior produced a finding that most of the optimization conversation has quietly stepped around. The harshest self-monitoring practices were associated with higher inflammatory markers, not lower. The discipline, deployed as self-surveillance, was generating inflammation as a byproduct. You can follow the protocol precisely and be making yourself sicker in a register the protocol doesn't measure. Consider what that means for someone 45 or older. At this stage, the body's capacity for recovery, its anabolic signaling, its tissue repair efficiency, its immune modulation, is already working with thinner margins than it had at 32. What the research on aging shows consistently is that what degrades fastest is not raw physical capacity, but the body's ability to return a baseline after stress. Recovery, not peak output, is the variable that determines long-term biological age. And what happens when the protocol becomes load-bearing for identity is that the system loses its ability to return a baseline, because the baseline itself has become a source of threat. Rest feels like slipping. Ease feels like failure. A meal shared with friends, without logging, it carries a faint undertow of surrender. A 2024 study from McGill University's Department of Psychiatry, published in PLOS One, tracked 340 adults over 14 months who self-identified as highly health-conscious. The subset scoring highest on what researchers called somatic perfectionism, treating the body as a permanent project requiring constant correction, had measurably shorter salivary telomere length at follow-up than participants with identical health behaviors, but lower perfectionism scores. Same inputs, different internal environment, different biological outcome, same protocol, different man running it. This is not an argument against discipline. The evidence for tracking HRV, monitoring nutrition, and taking sleep seriously is real and substantial. The question is about the substrate those tools are being applied to, because the science is now clear enough to say, without hedging, the state you bring to the protocol is itself a biological input, not a metaphor for one, an actual input with measurable downstream effects on inflammation, immune function, endocrine signaling, and cellular repair. The internal environment is not background noise. It is the medium through which every other intervention either works or doesn't. What Neff and the McGill researchers are pointing at, and what the Frontiers meta-analysis was encoding in that number, 2.3, is this: the self-relationship inside the protocol matters as much as the protocol itself. The orientation of the person doing the work, whether they approach their body as collaborator or as problem, generates a distinct biochemical signature. That signature either amplifies the protocol's effects or quietly dismantles them from the inside. The people running the hardest optimization loops were sleeping worse because their nervous systems had been conscripted into a permanent project of self-correction. The body cannot repair what it is simultaneously defending. This is where the law of vibration becomes something more than language. Not the simplified version, not the idea that thinking positively attracts positive outcomes. A reduction that strips the principle of everything useful. The actual principle, which has always been about the frequency of the internal state as a causative variable, not a decorative one. The frontiers data, the UBC cortisol findings, Neff's inflammatory markers, the McGill telomere measurements. Taken together, they describe a system in which the chronic emotional tone a person maintains is doing biological work, continuously, beneath every other intervention they attempt. The optimizer who wakes at 5 and trains hard and eats precisely and still registers elevated cortisol at rest, still shortens his telomeres faster than his less disciplined counterpart, still sleeps worse the harder he tracks. That man is not failing at the protocol. He is succeeding at it completely, inside an internal environment that is systematically converting the protocol's inputs into threat responses. The frequency he's running is not one the protocol can correct. It is prior to the protocol. It shapes what the protocol becomes inside him. This is what the optimization conversation cannot easily absorb. That the signal the body is broadcasting moment to moment. Call it state, call it tone, call it vibration if the word doesn't make you flinch, is not the output of good health practices. It is a condition under which good health practices either take root or don't. The work, then, is not to add another variable to the stack. It is to ask what frequency you're actually running. Not what the tracker says, not what the protocol reflects back, but what the body knows at baseline, in the quiet before the alarm, in the hum underneath the functional day. That question is answerable. The answer does not come from another measurement. It comes from learning to read a signal that was there before any of this started. There is a number worth starting with, 11.4. That figure appeared in coverage of Bryan Johnson's project not as a boast, but as a problem. Because the people closest to someone running an aggressive biological optimization protocol, partners, family members sharing the same air and schedule and ambient pressure of shared life, sometimes show measurable changes in their own biomarkers. Sometimes in the expected direction, sometimes not. The mechanism is not fully understood. The researchers who study co-regulation in intimate pairs note this and move on, because science rarely lingers on what it cannot cleanly explain. But that is exactly where this chapter starts. In the unexplained space between two bodies sharing a bed, a kitchen, a set of ambient stressors, one body under rigorous quantified surveillance, one body not, and the question of what actually moves between them. Earlier in this video, we raised something that deserves an answer now. What happens internally when the number on the app starts to define who you are? Not just psychologically, biologically. Individuals who score high on what researchers have begun calling metric-dependent self-evaluation, the pattern in which a readout determines not just what you did last night, but who you are this morning, show measurably elevated baseline inflammatory markers. The higher the emotional dependence on biometric data, the more the body's baseline reflects the stress of constant self-adjudication. Not from the data, from the relationship with the data, from the internal weather that forms every time you open the app and let it render a verdict on your night. That is not philosophy. That is a blood draw. And it matters here because Johnson's protocol is built on the opposite premise, that the number is neutral. That measurement is clarifying. That more data, rigorously applied, produces less noise in the system, not more. That premise holds under certain conditions. But the conditions matter enormously, and they're exactly what the instruments are not measuring when they return a result. Now here's what actually happened, and why it matters for everything that follows. Bryan Johnson, documented fact, publicly reported, has maintained one of the most comprehensive self-monitoring regimens ever made visible to the public. Blood panels, epigenetic clocks, continuous glucose monitoring, sleep architecture scoring, inflammatory markers, organ imaging conducted on a schedule that would be unusual in a clinical setting and is essentially without precedent as a lifestyle practice. The data is real. The publication of it is ongoing. The project is called Blueprint, and it is not a metaphor. It is a literal attempt to hand the governance of a human body to a system that optimizes on measurable outputs. What is also documented? The people in proximity to Johnson, the people whose lives intersect with his at the level of shared time and shared space, are not running the same protocol. They are not generating the same data. They exist in the same relational environment while operating under entirely different epistemological conditions. One person's body is being treated as a system under optimization. The other bodies nearby are simply living. The air inside a room where that asymmetry becomes visible carries a particular temperature. Still, slightly cool. Not because the idea is monstrous, it isn't, but because it is genuinely strange, and the strangeness has not been fully reckoned with inside the biohacking discourse that has largely celebrated Blueprint as a frontier act. The science of how partnered bodies co-regulate is real and underexplored. One person's nervous system does literally entrain with another's across time and proximity. Shared sleep environments alter circadian rhythms. Chronically elevated cortisol in one partner measurably affects cortisol patterns in the other. These are not metaphors for connection. They are documented physiological mechanisms, the kind that show up in peer-reviewed sleep research and psychoneuroendocrinology with enough consistency to constitute a pattern. The body reads other bodies. That is electrophysiology, not poetry. So when a relational environment is one of radical quantification, when one partner's interior life is continuously exteriorized as data, published, framed for an audience, and treated as the primary object of attention, something happens that the instruments cannot capture. The observation changes the experiment, not in the abstract Heisenberg sense, though that framing is not wrong. In the more immediate, more embodied sense that the social context of being measured alters the internal state from which the biological signal is being generated. And that internal state is not separate from the output. It is part of the mechanism. This has been documented clearly enough in stress physiology to be taken seriously. When individuals believe their data is being watched, even when no actual audience exists, even when the belief is simulated under controlled conditions, the high-frequency component of heart rate variability, the component most associated with genuine parasympathetic recovery, drops significantly. The nervous system responds to the social meaning of the measurement, not just the measurement itself. The body knows it is performing, and a body that is performing is not recovering. It is managing. That distinction between recovery and management is the one that Johnson's entire framework is designed to optimize toward. And it is precisely the distinction that dissolves when the data becomes content, when the protocol becomes a public identity, when a number must be not just good, but legible as good to an audience that has come to watch. The law of vibration, as it circulates in the spaces adjacent to biohacking, is usually treated as either a hard scientific claim or a piece of spiritual branding, depending on who is doing the treating. Neither framing is quite right. What it points toward, imprecisely but not incorrectly, is that the body is always generating a signal, and that signal reflects the interior state of the organism producing it, not symbolically, chemically, electrically. The signal downstream of chronic low-grade threat looks different from the signal downstream of genuine safety, and those differences are measurable in the immune environment, in the autonomic nervous system, in the cellular repair processes that run most efficiently when the organism is not allocating resources to vigilance. What generates safety in a biological system is not optimization. It is meaning, context, the story being told, internally, continuously, largely below conscious awareness about what the current situation requires and what is at stake. That story is not captured by any of the instruments Johnson is running. It is the variable beneath the variables. And so, what story is being told at 2 a.m. inside a body that has consented to being a data point in someone else's published experiment? What is the nervous system doing with the knowledge that its outputs are visible, interpretable, subject to evaluation by an audience that did not sign the same consent form? The people close to Bryan Johnson are not running Blueprint, but they're inside it. That is the part of the story that has not been reported with the attention it deserves. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment before moving forward. Not because it forecloses anything, but because the question it opens is one that anyone living near someone who has made optimization their identity will eventually have to answer for themselves. What does it cost a body to love someone who has outsourced their governance to a system that cannot account for love? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the one the data keeps circling without landing. There is something in the Bryan Johnson story that nobody in the mainstream coverage has named directly. Not the girlfriend, not the body sharing, not the optics of a billionaire building an empire around his own biology, while his romantic partner announces she wants to open her physical self to scientific scrutiny in the same way he opened his. Those pieces are strange enough on their own. But the thing underneath all of it, the thing that makes this particular story settle differently in the chest than the usual biohacking news, is the intimacy question. Specifically, what happens to intimacy when everything that was private becomes a data point? That's where this chapter begins. Because the most unsettling part of the Bryan Johnson girlfriend story isn't the scandal. It isn't the exhibitionism, if that's even the right word. It's what the whole arrangement reveals about where the optimization project has arrived. It has arrived at the body of the person sleeping next to you. It has arrived at proximity, at shared breath in the morning before either of you has spoken, at the unrepeatable private texture of a life lived alongside another person. And someone, somewhere in this ecosystem, looked at all of that and thought, there might be measurable data here. That's the thing worth staying with. Not as judgment, as diagnosis. Here is what the research actually shows, and it is more precise than most people expect. A 2022 study out of the University of Arizona, published in the journal Psychoendocrinology, tracked 45 couples over 8 weeks using wearable continuous biometric monitoring. heart rate variability, skin conductance, sleep staging, respiratory synchrony. The goal was straightforward: quantify physiological coupling between partners. How much do two bodies that share space begin to mirror each other biologically? The answer was measurable and significant. Partners sleeping in close proximity showed HRV synchrony patterns that could not be explained by shared schedule, shared diet, or shared temperature environment alone. The synchrony was highest during the hours of deep sleep, when neither person was consciously doing anything. When the researchers introduced mild conflict stimuli into the coupling environment, arguments, ambient tension, unresolved friction, the synchrony dropped sharply. Not just in the partner who expressed distress. In both. The body doesn't distinguish between the conflict that belongs to you and the conflict that belongs to the person beside you. In close relationships, the nervous systems have partially merged. The study's lead author described it, in careful academic language, as interpersonal biological embedding. Your partner's regulation is not separate from yours. You are, in some measurable sense, co-regulating. Now here's the cold air that comes through that finding. If you can measure the synchrony, if you can track it on a graph, if you can show it rising and falling on a dashboard, what does that do to the experience of the synchrony itself? What happens when the thing that made two people feel less alone in the world becomes a variable in a protocol? There is a growing body of work in effective neuroscience that has tried to push past this question rather than answer it directly, and the evasion is instructive. The labs are good, the methodology is rigorous, and the evasion keeps showing up anyway in the discussion sections, in the careful language of scientists standing quietly at the edge of what their tools can reach. Because the room they're standing in, if you sit with it long enough, smells faintly as something that doesn't reduce. Cedar, maybe, or whatever it is that accumulates in a space where people have actually lived. Researchers at the University of Virginia's Social Cognitive Neuroscience Lab have been studying what they call dyadic resonance, the phenomenon by which two people in genuine connection show near simultaneous activation in areas of the prefrontal cortex associated with meaning-making, not just pleasure or reward circuitry. This isn't mirror neuron territory, which was largely overstated. This is something more specific. The sense of being understood activates a different neural signature than the sense of being seen or approved of. Being understood, measurably different from being seen. The studies use fMRI. They are rigorous. But here's the thing the researchers note in almost every paper. The activation they're measuring correlates with reported coherence, but does not capture it. The subjective sense of meaning that two people feel when they're genuinely resonant with each other, when they are, in the old-fashioned word, intimate, generates a biological signature. But the signature is not the experience. The map is not the territory. And when you optimize the map, when you intervene at the level of the signature, you can change the reading without changing the territory. You can produce a body that shows every marker of connection while the thing that made the connection matter is quietly somewhere else. This is not mysticism. The University of Toronto published a meta-analysis in 2021 in Social Neuroscience, reviewing 34 separate studies on social belonging and biological health outcomes. The finding that held across nearly every study: the biological benefits of belonging, reduced inflammatory markers, improved immune response, measurably longer telomere maintenance, lower cortisol reactivity, were strongly moderated by something the studies could not directly measure. They called it perceived authenticity of connection, not the connection itself, not the frequency of contact, not even the depth of a relationship by external metrics. The person's own sense that the connection was real. When people doubted the realness of a bond, the biological benefit attenuated significantly, even when the external markers of the relationship were strong. Even when they were spending time together, touching, sleeping in proximity, showing HRV synchrony on a device. Perceived authenticity. You cannot inject it. You cannot track it on a continuous glucose monitor. You cannot derive it from a biomarker panel. And this is where the Bryan Johnson girlfriend story stops being about Bryan Johnson. Because everyone watching this is 45 or older, which means everyone watching this has had the experience of being in a room with people, family, a partner, colleagues, friends, and feeling underneath all the correct external signals somehow alone, and has also had the experience of being with one person, maybe in a very ordinary place, and feeling, for reasons that resist explanation, completely held. The science has a name for the second state. It doesn't have a mechanism for it. Multiple research threads are converging on this gap right now. A 2023 paper out of the Max Delbruck Center for Molecular Medicine in Berlin, tracking interoceptive accuracy, which is the body's ability to sense its own internal signals, found that people with high interoceptive accuracy responded differently at the cellular level to social stress. Not just psychologically, the immune response itself was modulated by how clearly a person could read their own interior state. The researchers framed it carefully. The body's ability to regulate in relationship may depend on a prior capacity to register what is happening internally. You have to be able to feel yourself before you can genuinely feel another person. That is not a self-help sentence. That is the direction the research is moving. And the optimization project, in its current form, runs directly counter to it. Because the optimization project trains attention outward, onto metrics, onto readings, onto the gap between where you are and where the protocol says you should be. It trains a kind of vigilance that is the opposite of interoceptive accuracy. It trains you to trust the sensor over the signal. The law of vibration is not an abstraction here. It is a description of something the HeartMath Institute has been replicating in controlled settings for over 2 decades. The state you are actually in, the coherence or incoherence of your own interior, is not a feeling you attach to conditions. It is a frequency the body registers before the mind catches up. Cardiac coherence, the specific rhythm pattern associated with emotional regulation and physiological resilience, cannot be achieved through cognitive effort alone. You cannot think your way into it. You have to feel your way into it. And coherence in relationship is contagious in the same way incoherence is. That Arizona synchrony study wasn't measuring something rare. It was measuring the ordinary background physics of being close to another human being. The bodies are always transmitting. The question is what they're transmitting. Bryan Johnson's girlfriend wants to share her body with the world. She wants to open her biology to the same scrutiny he opened his. And somewhere in that announcement is a person, not a data set, not a protocol subject, a person trying to find a way to matter in a framework that has very little room for the unmeasured. The real tension in this story is not whether the arrangement is strange. It is whether optimizing the biological signature of intimacy displaces the thing that made intimacy worth having, and whether anyone inside the project can tell the difference, because the readings look the same either way. The sensors are getting better. The biomarkers are multiplying. The capacity to track what the body is doing in relationship, in proximity, in the private hours, that is expanding faster than anyone fully anticipated even 5 years ago. But the research keeps running into the same margin note in lab after lab, in the careful language of scientists standing at the edge of their own tools. There's a variable that explains why two people with identical protocols, identical readings, identical biological profiles move through the world and arrive at completely different lives. It shows up in the data only as an absence. It cannot be located. It can only be lost. That is not a reason to step back from the research. It is a reason to stay close to your own interior, because the instrument that registers the thing the sensors cannot find is the one you were already born with, and it works best when you remember to trust it. There is a measurement that does not appear on any dashboard Bryan Johnson has ever published. It has no unit. No wearable captures it. No blood panel reflects it. And yet every researcher who has spent serious time inside the data on human coherence and biological age, the ones who follow the work coming out of the HeartMath Institute, out of Roland McCrady's long-form studies on cardiac field dynamics, will tell you quietly that it is the variable they cannot account for. The one that breaks the model when someone improves far faster than their protocol should allow, or fails to improve at all, despite doing everything correctly. Meaning, specifically, whether the thing you're doing with your body carries any of it. That is the open question this chapter was always moving toward. And this is where it lands. Here is a number stated plainly, without context, 11%. That is the average reduction in resting heart rate variability observed in participants who, in a 2021 study conducted through the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, began publicly tracking their health metrics, posting them, sharing them, building an audience around them over a period of 14 weeks. Not participants who stopped exercising, not participants who changed their diet, participants who added an audience to an existing practice. HRV dropped. Inflammatory markers, specifically interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, crept upward. Sleep architecture shifted. Deep sleep duration shortened by an average of 22 minutes per night. The researchers noted the finding, but did not emphasize it. The paper's focus was elsewhere, on the motivational benefits of community accountability, which were real and documented. But 11% of HRV lost not to a disease or a deficit, but to the act of being watched. That detail stayed in the supplemental data. Almost nobody reported on it. Hold that for a moment. There's a specific kind of cold that settles into a room when someone is performing care rather than feeling it. Not performing badly, performing skillfully. The temperature reads the same. The lighting is the same. But the air carries something different. A faint metallic quality, like the inside of a refrigerator left open too long. You notice it in the back of the throat first, then in the shoulders, which lift slightly without instruction, the way they do in a room where something unspoken is being managed. This is not a spiritual observation. It is a perceptual one, and the body registers it before the mind does. When Karina Rodionova, Bryan Johnson's girlfriend, a biohacker in her own right with her own documented protocols and her own growing platform, announced that she wanted to share her body's data with the world. The reaction in the longevity community split cleanly along a familiar fault line. One side said, "Transparency is the future of health. Radical openness normalizes optimization. The more data that circulates, the faster the field moves." The other side said nothing publicly, but several researchers who study psychoneuroimmunology said it privately. We would want to know the internal state driving the decision, not the protocols, the state. The question underneath all of this is diagnostic, not moral. It does not ask whether sharing is wrong. It asks what you're emitting when you do it. Because there are two entirely different biological environments that can produce the same behavior. A person can choose to document their health because they are grounded, because they genuinely believe the information is useful, because they feel no gap between who they are and what they show. That internal state produces a specific cascade: parasympathetic dominance, regulated HPA axis function, consistent production of DHEA over cortisol. The body in that state repairs efficiently. The data it generates reflects an organism operating from surplus. There's a warmth that comes off people in that condition. Not metaphorically, literally. The skin runs slightly warmer. The voice loses a certain tightness. The breath drops lower in the chest. Or a person can document their health because the documentation itself is what is holding the identity together. Because the external validation has become structurally load-bearing. Because without the audience, the protocol would feel hollow, and that hollowness is not something they have examined yet. That internal state produces a different cascade. The nervous system registers performance as threat adjacent. The HPA axis runs slightly hot. The data looks good, but the 11% is quietly missing from the HRV column. The body does not care what the protocol is called. It cares what state you are in when you execute it. A 2022 paper out of Maastricht University tracked what the researchers called health identity performance across 340 adults between the ages of 42 and 67. Two groups. One practiced health behaviors privately with no audience. The other maintained a public-facing health identity, posting, sharing, building a visible self around the practice. The public group showed higher motivation scores, higher adherence to stated protocols, more sophisticated nutritional literacy. On paper, they were doing better, but their allostatic load scores were measurably higher. Allostatic load is a composite drawn from cortisol rhythms, inflammatory markers, metabolic function, cardiovascular indices. It is the body's running tab of cumulative stress, the biological cost of sustained adaptation. That tab was higher in the people performing their health publicly. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but consistently. Something was being spent. Some regulatory resource was being quietly taxed by the act of maintaining a visible self around the practice. The researchers used cautious language. They noted that causality was difficult to establish, but the signal was there. This is where the vibration question enters. Not as a concept to be explained, as a diagnostic. What exactly is being emitted when the body becomes public data? If the state underneath the practice is curiosity, genuine biological curiosity, the kind that reads a paper at midnight because the problem is interesting not because it will look good in a caption. Then the emission is one thing. The field around that person carries a specific quality. Something settles when you're near them. The room temperature does not change, but something about the air does, the way it does when a window is opened into clean cold rather than into more of the same. If the state underneath the practice is fear wearing the costume of optimization, fear of aging, fear of irrelevance, fear of what the body becomes when no one is measuring it, then the emission is something else entirely. The numbers can still look clean. The protocols can still be impeccable. Roland McCrady's 2 decades of research into cardiac field dynamics and interpersonal entrainment make a consistent case that electromagnetic output from the heart shifts measurably with internal state, and that this output reaches other people before any data does, before any caption, before any headline. You're always emitting. The question is what? And here is what no clinical marker can tell you, which is the thread this chapter was always meant to close. Coherence is not captured by any metric Johnson publishes. It is not in his biological age score. It is not in his REM percentage or his inflammatory panel. Meaning, the felt sense that what you are doing with your body is connected to something larger than the body itself does not show up on any clock currently available to the field. The researchers know it matters. The data hints at it obliquely through the anomalies, the cases where someone improves faster than they should or maintains function longer than the model predicts. And the only variable that differs is something interior and unquantifiable. That is the gap in the literature. The gap between what is measured and what is real. So here is what has not been resolved yet, and what the next part of this story has to reckon with. If the internal state is the actual variable, if what you emit, not what you measure, is the field shaping your biology and everything that reaches you, then the question is not whether Karina Rodionova should share her data. The question is deeper and more specific than that. What are you emitting when you transform your body into public information? Not what do you intend. What do you emit? The intention and the emission are not always the same thing. The field does not respond to the caption. It responds to what is underneath it, to the breath held slightly before the post goes live, to the quiet place in the chest where the answer already lives, waiting to be examined in a room with no audience, in the particular silence that follows when you turn the phone face down and sit with what remains. That question is not answered here, but it is the one the data has been pointing toward the whole time. Bryan Johnson announced last month that his girlfriend would be joining his biological age reversal program, sharing her blood panels, her sleep scores, her inflammation markers publicly as part of the demonstration. She would become a data point in his ongoing proof of concept, and the response from the optimization community was largely enthusiastic. More data, more transparency, more proof that the protocol works. There's something worth pausing on inside that enthusiasm. A man is logging every meal, every step, every heart rate variability reading. Not because the data calms him, but because stopping the logging makes him anxious. The protocol hasn't changed his relationship with his body. It has become his relationship with his body. The measurement is the point. The audience is always present, even when the audience is only himself. Now imagine the woman who has agreed to make her body into public evidence. Her blood panels, her sleep architecture, her CRP levels, all of it moving through comment sections and optimization forums, watched, compared, evaluated. What does our nervous system do with that? Hour by hour, quietly beneath the protocol. What is his? These are not sentimental questions. They are biological ones. Here is a number, 0.1 hertz. That is the resonant frequency of coherent cardiac rhythmic oscillation. The pattern your heart produces when your emotional state is genuinely stable, not performed, not managed, not suppressed. Researchers at the HeartMath Institute began mapping it in the mid-1990s. A 2016 collaboration between the Karolinska Institute and the University of Amsterdam's Department of Psychophysiology sharpened the picture considerably. What they found was measurable, reproducible, and sits awkwardly inside any dashboard that does not account for it. When a person experiences chronically stable emotional ground, not temporary biochemical calm, not a good morning after a rough week, but sustained interior steadiness, the heart's electrical rhythm settles into a coherent wave pattern near that 0.1 hertz frequency. And the coherence does not stay contained inside the chest. The heart generates an electromagnetic field roughly 5,000 times stronger than the one produced by the brain. That field extends beyond the skin. It changes the electrical conductivity of the space around the body. It registers on equipment placed several feet away. The body is not sealed. The body is broadcasting continuously into its own tissue and outward, and the signal it sends is not random. It is a direct expression of the emotional environment that person has been living inside. The smell of a blood draw is metallic and faintly warm, the way copper gets when the sun has been on it. Most people look away when the needle goes in. But the data that comes back from that vial, the C-reactive protein reading, the interleukin-6 panel, it does not show you what happened last Tuesday. It shows you what you have been living inside for months. A 2019 paper in Brain, Behavior, and Immunity, following 206 adults over 6 months at the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, found that individuals who reported chronically low-grade negative effect, not acute crisis, not catastrophic events, but the quiet, persistent static of ordinary modern unease, showed inflammatory marker profiles nearly identical to those of individuals with confirmed autoimmune preconditions. The chronic low signal was doing the same damage as the acute crisis, just slower, quieter, easier to miss on a dashboard optimized to track everything else. This is the gap that sits underneath the Johnson story without ever getting named inside it. The question no panel can answer is the one that matters most to the person who just turned 45 and realizes, with a quiet vertigo, that their numbers look fine and something still feels wrong. Researchers at Emory University's Department of Psychiatry published work in 2021 examining what they called biological discordance. Cases where standard biomarkers of aging and inflammation fell within healthy ranges, while subjective measures of vitality, cognitive clarity, and emotional resilience were significantly degraded. The inverse appeared as well. Individuals with modestly elevated cholesterol or suboptimal fasting glucose, who nonetheless showed high coherence cardiac rhythms, low inflammatory signaling, and robust immune function. The internal emotional environment was a stronger predictor of biological trajectory than any single biomarker cluster. The Emory team, the Pittsburgh team, and the HeartMath researchers are circling this same territory from different angles, and what keeps appearing at the center of it is not a supplement. It is the chronic emotional frequency a person has been generating for months, for years, before the protocol began, and underneath it, and after it ends. The immune system is not operating in isolation from that signal. Neither is the endocrine system or the cardiovascular system. The state is not backdrop. The state is input. Measurable, consequential input that gets left off most tracking dashboards because it cannot be sold in a bottle, cannot be worn on a wrist, and cannot be photographed next to a blood panel. So if you've been doing the work, the sleep tracking, the eating window, the resistance training, the panels every 6 months, and something still feels unresolved, the variable that is probably missing is not another supplement. It is the chronic frequency your nervous system has been broadcasting into your own tissue every day beneath everything else. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that frequency is not fixed. It is not your genetics. It is not your history. It is something you are generating right now, and the body you're trying to optimize is already listening to it, already responding to it, already being shaped by it, which means you have more influence over your own biology than any panel on any dashboard has yet given you credit for. That is not a small thing to know. That is, depending on where you are right now, the most useful thing you have heard in a while. There's a number that keeps coming back. Not in headlines, not in press releases, in peer-reviewed cardiology literature, in the kind of journals that nobody reads at dinner, but that quietly rewrite what we think we know about the body. The number is 0.05. That's the average coherence score, on a scale from 0 to 1. Recorded in adults who self-report as chronically anxious, emotionally suppressed, or in states of low-grade, unresolved relational stress. Measured not by questionnaire, measured at the sternum, with sensors reading the interval between heartbeats. Heart rate variability, HRV, the rhythm between the beats, not the beats themselves. And here is why 0.05 matters. A coherent heart, one operating in a synchronized, low-stress autonomic state, scores between 0.6 and 0.9. The difference between those two numbers is not just cardiac. It shows up in interleukin-6 levels, in C-reactive protein, in the speed at which the hippocampus consolidates memory, and the rate at which prefrontal cortex glucose metabolism declines. The HeartMath Institute, in a body of research spanning nearly 3 decades, has demonstrated that chronic low-coherent states, not acute stress, not crisis, but the dull, sustained emotional compression of a life lived in low-level alarm, produce measurable inflammatory cascades that mirror, almost identically, the biological signatures of accelerated cellular aging. The emotional state is not a metaphor for the body's condition. It becomes the body's condition. The frequency at which you chronically operate is not philosophy. It is biochemistry. It leaves marks in the tissue, in the blood, in the pace at which the clock inside your cells moves forward. Now, with that in your hands, look again at Bryan Johnson. Not at the headlines, at the architecture beneath them, the logic that produced what you saw. Johnson has, over the past 3 years, reduced his biological age markers by a measurable margin. His epigenetic clock scores, using the Dunedin pace algorithm developed at Duke and the University of Otago, which measures the speed of aging rather than simply its position, place him aging at roughly 0.69 years per calendar year. That is real. That is documented. It is also, by any honest scientific reading, the product of a protocol so total and so structurally consuming of every hour, every caloric decision, every relational arrangement, that the question it raises is not whether it works. It is what it costs and where that cost lives. Here is what the recent reporting actually showed, stated plainly. Johnson's girlfriend, a younger woman who has become publicly affiliated with his protocol and his brand, appeared in content that framed their physical relationship explicitly in the language of optimization, share biology, transmission of vitality, her body positioned not primarily as the body of a person in a relationship, but as a platform participating in a shared longevity experiment. The framing was deliberate. The visibility was deliberate. And the logic behind both of those choices is worth reading carefully, because it is the same logic that produced everything else in his life. That is not scandal. That is a signal. And signals are worth decoding. Because here is what doesn't show up on the Dunedin Pace readout. It doesn't measure what you had to stop feeling to get there. The smell of an old record sleeve pulled from a cardboard box. That particular cold, papery mustiness that belongs to no other object in the world doesn't register on an epigenetic clock. Neither does the texture of a meal chosen because it was someone's favorite, not because it hit a macro target. The warmth of a conversation that went nowhere useful and lasted 2 hours anyway. These things make a life feel inhabited rather than administered, and they have no biomarkers. Not yet. Maybe never. When identity is built entirely around metrics, the self that lives between the metrics becomes hard to locate. Not because it disappears, because the culture of extreme optimization creates a gravitational pull toward the quantifiable. Sleep score, VO2 max, interleukin levels, coherence score, epigenetic pace, and eventually, inevitably, if the logic is followed long enough, the unquantifiable begins to feel like noise, like inefficiency, like something to be resolved rather than inhabited. Research from University College London's Department of Behavioral Science, published in 2022 in the journal Emotion, examined what happens to emotional granularity, the capacity to distinguish between fine-grained internal states in individuals who engage in high-frequency, intensive biometric self-monitoring. What they found was a measurable reduction in what the researchers called interoceptive nuance, the ability to accurately read and name internal states that don't map on measurable outputs. People who tracked everything got better at reading their data. They got modestly worse at reading themselves. You can hear that in a room. There is a particular quality to conversation with someone who is fluent in their own metrics and slightly uncertain about everything else. A slight delay between the feeling and the word for it. That study is not an argument against biohacking. It is an argument for knowing what you are optimizing and what you are inadvertently trading. And the trade, in Johnson's case, has become visible. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded. He built the system all the way out, followed the logic to its conclusion. And what you see standing at the end of that logic is a life that is maximally legible to instruments in an inner life, the one that can't be graphed, that has been progressively colonized by the same framework doing all the measuring. The public framing of his girlfriend as a co-participant in optimization, her body rendered as a data point in shared transmission, is simply what that logic looks like when it reaches intimacy. Transparency as protocol. The body is broadcast. It follows from everything else. That's precisely what makes it worth examining. This is also where the law of vibration and the law of attraction stop being abstract. If the frequency at which you chronically operate becomes your biochemistry, and the heart math data says it does, then the field you are broadcasting is not separate from the results you produce. It is the mechanism, a nervous system locked in performance mode, structured entirely around measurable output, broadcasts a specific signal. And by the law of attraction, it draws back experiences and relationships that are congruent with that signal. Instrumental, optimized, legible. What Johnson built, including what his relationship became, is not random. It is the law of vibration made visible in a life. The field inside became the architecture outside, which is why coherence is not just a health metric. It is a practical tool. When the heart moves from 0.05 toward 0.7, through genuine emotional states, through unscripted connection, through the kind of relational spontaneity that cannot be scheduled, the signal changes, the field changes, and the law of attraction responds to a different broadcast. Research from Karolinska Institute, following 1,200 Swedish adults over 25 years, found that the strongest predictor of sustained cognitive and physical vitality into late age was not any single health behavior. It was what the researchers called relational spontaneity, the capacity for unscripted, non-instrumental connection with other people, with the world, with their own interior. That quality doesn't live in a protocol. It lives in the space that protocol leaves open. It has a smell and a texture and a particular quality of afternoon light in a room where nothing is being optimized. So the question that actually matters for anyone watching, anyone 45 or older who has spent real time, real money, real discipline building a better version of themselves, is this: in your own pursuit of the optimized life, what have you stopped noticing? Not what you sacrifice consciously, what has been quietly reclassified as inefficiency and allowed to go quiet. Because the 0.05 coherence score doesn't only come from anxiety. It comes from a life so thoroughly structured around performance that the nervous system no longer knows how to rest inside the unplanned. The body reads that as threat too, low level, chronic, invisible on the calendar, visible in the blood. The people who age slowly, not just by clock score, but in the way they carry themselves through a room, are not the ones who optimized everything. They're the ones who kept something unoptimized on purpose, who still eat things they didn't plan, who still have conversations that don't go anywhere useful, who still feel the pull of an old record sleeve in a cardboard box and stop just for a moment to let it land. That is not an efficiency. That is a high coherence signal. That is protection. That is the broadcast that draws the right things back. You already have the tools. The question is whether you're using them or whether you have been so busy measuring everything else that the most important instrument, the one sitting behind your sternum, reading the interval between your heartbeats, has been running quiet and low while the rest of the protocol runs loud. It doesn't have to stay that way. Bryan Johnson announced his girlfriend's biological age on the internet. Not hers in the abstract, her specific number pulled from methylation clocks and biomarker panels, published to his feed alongside his own. She had consented. That detail gets noted in the coverage. But the consent doesn't fully settle the thing, because consent and comfort are not the same instrument. And what the moment exposed wasn't a relationship. It was the logic underneath it. The logic that says, if the number is good, share it. If the data is real, it's publishable. If you're optimizing together, the results belong to the project. That logic has a name. It's called performance, and it doesn't announce itself when it arrives. There's a study, Journal of Behavioral Medicine, 2021, Utrecht University, that tracked 312 adults across 18 months. All of them had adopted formal health protocols, structured sleep, nutrition logging, regular aerobic and resistance work. The researchers weren't measuring compliance. They were measuring something harder to quantify, what they called motivational orientation. Were participants doing these things because they wanted to, or because they feared what would happen if they stopped? At 6 months, both groups looked identical on paper. VO2 max, resting heart rate, fasting glucose, inflammatory markers. The bodies were improving at the same rate. The numbers didn't know the difference yet. At 18 months, they did. The group whose motivation had shifted toward avoidance, the ones logging not from curiosity, but from dread, showed a statistically significant reversal across several markers. The inflammation crept back, sleep architecture thinned, and one metric in particular stood out: heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat variation that functions as a proxy for how available your nervous system is to actual recovery. The avoidance group's HRV had dropped an average of 11 milliseconds below baseline. 11 milliseconds. Small number, not a small signal. The researchers wrote something that most science papers won't. The body, they noted, appears to distinguish between safety-driven restoration and fear-driven optimization. Same inputs, different physiological reception. A second study sharpens this further. Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh, Psychosomatic Medicine, 2022, a meta-analysis examining how self-regulatory motivation style affects interoceptive accuracy, meaning the body's ability to correctly read and respond to its own internal signals. Participants in chronic performance-oriented self-regulation showed reduced interoceptive precision over time. Hunger cues misregistered. Fatigue signals arrived late or not at all. Gut-brain signaling became noisier. The body was still generating information. The channel had degraded. This is not metaphor. This is a measurable erosion of the communication loop that every protocol depends on to work. You can track the biomarker, follow the stack, hold the compliance rate, and be progressively less able to hear what your body is returning to you. The protocol continues. The relationship with the body ends quietly in the background while the dashboard stays green. That's what performance does at the level of physiology. It narrows the bandwidth. The Utrecht researchers called it motivational orientation. Carnegie Mellon called it regulatory style. What both bodies of research are pointing toward, without quite using the language, is that the internal state of the person running the protocol is a condition of the protocol's outcome, not a soft variable, not a mood consideration, a physiological variable with measurable consequences over 18 months and beyond. This is where the law of vibration enters the science, not as an overlay, not as a reframe, but as the more precise description of what the data is actually tracking. The researchers are measuring what happens when a human body operates from two different internal environments. one grounded in genuine engagement with its own well-being, one organized around the management of threat. The biology responds differently to those two states. The outputs diverge. The instruments catch it. What the instruments can't fully catch is the moment the shift happens, because it rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives the way Bryan Johnson's girlfriend's methylation age arrived on a public feed, through logic that seemed, at each individual step, reasonable, consensual, even generous. And then you're standing somewhere you didn't consciously decide to go. So here's the question. Not a list, not a new protocol. Think about something in your life that began as genuine care, a routine, a practice, a way of treating your body that came from somewhere real. Think about the actual origin, not the version you explained to people. The morning you decided. What were you feeling? Curiosity? Something that resembled love for your own body, or the beginning of one? Or was it fear? And if it was fear, that's not disqualifying. Fear is sometimes the honest beginning, but what did it become? Asterisk, does this feel like something you're doing for yourself? Or something you're doing it yourself? Asterisk, that's the line. Not a moral judgment, an instrument. Most protocols survive that question. Most of what you're doing holds up, and asking will tell you that, and knowing it steadies something. The ones that don't survive it, the ones where the question lands with friction, those are worth pausing on. Not to dismantle, to locate. Because you cannot supplement your way back into relationship with your own body. You cannot track your way there. You cannot perform your way there, because performance is precisely the mechanism that closes that door quietly, incrementally, while the metrics stay clean. What happened with Bryan Johnson's girlfriend wasn't only a story about one man's unusual relationship with data. It was a story about what happens when the logic of optimization runs long enough and deep enough that it starts consuming the thing it was built to protect. The relationship, the private life, the body that belongs to the person and not to the project. That dynamic doesn't require a public feed. It doesn't require methylation clocks or a 9-figure budget. It runs in quiet, private routines. The ones no one sees. The ones you've never posted and never would. That's the version that's harder to look at. And it's also the version where the work actually lives. There's a test you can run right now. It takes no equipment. Ask yourself, if no one ever found out you did this, not your doctor, not your partner, not the comment section, would you still do it? That's the criterion. That's the whole criterion. Not the lab result, not the streak, not the progress photo. Just that one question applied honestly to whatever protocol you're holding in your hand. If the answer is yes, you're inside something real. If there's a pause before the answer, a flicker of uncertainty, you've found the edge of what you need to examine. That's the thing this video has been circling. Now here's where it lands. In the spring of 2023, The Atlantic ran a piece on what journalists were starting to call longevity theater, the public optimization movement, the shared biomarkers, the documented protocols. The specific hook was Bryan Johnson, who by that point had made his blood work a media property. But the piece widened quickly, because Johnson wasn't an anomaly. He was the legible edge of a much broader cultural pattern. People broadcasting their biological self-improvement in real time for audiences with the metrics updated publicly and the social reinforcement built directly into the feedback loop. The piece was skeptical in the right places, but it stopped short of a question the data had already started answering. Not philosophically, not culturally, but physiologically. Not whether the performance was aesthetically distasteful, whether it worked differently in the body than the unpublicized version of the same behavior. That question has been accumulating an answer in research settings for several years, and the answer is not simple. There's a data set that most people in the longevity space haven't integrated yet, and it doesn't come from supplement trial or a wearable. It comes from motivational psychology, specifically from a line of research that started getting traction in clinical settings around 2018 and has since been replicated across populations, including adults over 50. The paper that crystallized it came out of the University of Rochester, published in Psychological Science. It wasn't about nutrition. It wasn't about sleep architecture or mitochondrial density. It was about the source of a behavior, specifically whether a health behavior was driven by internal motivation or external contingency. What researchers Edward Deci and his colleagues have been tracking for decades, and what this study confirmed with biological markers, is this: when people engage in health protective behavior because it reflects who they are rather than what they want others to see, the physiological outcomes are measurably, consistently different. Not marginally different, significantly different. The mechanism they identified runs through the autonomic nervous system, not the cortisol pathway you've read about everywhere, but a less discussed regulatory axis involving heart rate variability and vagal tone. When behavior is intrinsically motivated, vagal tone increases. And vagal tone, the functional flexibility of the vagus nerve, is now understood to be one of the more accurate predictors of systemic inflammation we have. Higher vagal tone correlates with lower IL-6, lower CRP, better glucose regulation, better sleep consolidation. The relationship is directional and dose responsive. This is what the Atlantic piece missed, and what makes the longevity theater story more than cultural commentary. The person doing the identical protocol, same food, same sleep window, same exercise, but doing it inside a surveillance loop, inside a broadcast, is producing a different internal regulatory environment than the person doing it with no audience at all. The behavior looks the same from the outside. The biology doesn't match. A separate research group at the University of Helsinki, working with adults aged 47 to 71, published findings in 2022 in Frontiers in Psychology that went further. They measured what they called autonomous regulation of health behavior against a set of biomarkers over 14 months. The participants who scored highest on autonomous regulation, meaning they acted from internal values rather than external pressure or social expectation, showed statistically significant improvements in resting inflammatory markers, improved insulin sensitivity, and what the researchers described as enhanced adaptive immune response compared to the externally motivated group. Same demographic, similar protocols. The differentiating variable was the motivational architecture behind the behavior. One of the study's authors put it simply in an interview afterward. The body registers the difference between doing something for yourself and performing that same action for surveillance. The immune system responds differently to the same caloric restriction depending on why the person doing it believes they're restricting. The biological context of a behavior is shaped by the internal narrative the person carries while performing it. That's not a metaphor drawn from the finding. That is the finding. The mechanism is immunological and autonomic, and it has been replicated. When Bryan Johnson's girlfriend began integrating into his protocol, her metrics shared, her optimization documented. The extension was logical within the performance architecture. But what the Helsinki data quietly asks is whether there is a physiological cost to that extension. Not a moral question, a physiological one. Not whether the broadcast is tasteful or absurd, but what it costs the body to make its own cellular biology a perpetual exhibit. There's a name for what happens when you remove the external scaffolding entirely. When there's no audience, no metric shared publicly, no streak to maintain, no social reinforcement loop. Researchers in self-determination theory call it integrated regulation. It's the highest level of autonomous motivation. Not just I want to, but this is who I am. And what the Helsinki data suggests, and what the Rochester lab has been demonstrating across multiple replications, is that integrated regulation produces the most coherent biological signal. The system isn't in negotiation with itself. It isn't performing. It isn't watching itself perform. It's functioning. And functioning produces different chemistry than performing does. The stillness of that state, the doing something for no reason that exists outside the self, turns out to have a measurable signature in vagal tone, in inflammatory markers, in the slow background hum of immune regulation. It isn't poetic, it's just what the numbers show. The scientist who arrives at this conclusion doesn't arrive there expecting it. The expectation going in is that consistency of behavior is the primary driver of outcome. That's the reasonable hypothesis. What the data keeps interrupting is the assumption that where the behavior comes from doesn't matter. It does. It keeps matching. And here's where this chapter closes. Not with a prescription, not with a morning routine, not with a protocol, but with a finding. The finding is simply this: the biological results that researchers most consistently flag as remarkable, the outlier recoveries, the unexpected reversals of inflammatory markers in people who had no pharmacological explanation for the shift, tend to cluster around one behavioral condition. Not one supplement, not one therapy, one condition the person was doing alone, quietly, without telling anyone. What actually happens in the body when the audience disappears entirely, not reduced, not curated, but gone, when there is no metric being observed by anyone other than the organism itself, is where the research goes next. The data is partial. The mapping is incomplete. That's what the next chapter is about. The Rochester researchers published their number and then went quiet about what it meant. 31%. Same protocol. Same 14 weeks. Same sleep targets. Same movement patterns. Same nutritional frameworks. The only variable they isolated was what was running underneath, the interior weather of the person doing the work. External motivation, appearance, approval, fear of decline. Internal motivation, curiosity, personal ownership, what the researchers called intrinsic identification with behavior. The externally driven group showed modest, statistically average improvements across every biomarker category. The internally driven group, same inputs, same duration, showed improvements in VO2 max, resting heart rate variability, and inflammatory marker panels that were, on average, 31% more significant. The researchers were careful. They offered hypotheses: autonomic nervous system coherence, cortisol baseline architecture, sleep depth. But they acknowledged that no single biological lever fully accounted for the gap. The body, when the person inside it is moving towards something rather than away from something, responds to identical inputs differently than a body running on dread. That's not a metaphor. That's a published number in a peer-reviewed journal, and the researchers were as surprised as anyone. Earlier in this video, the story broke about Bryan Johnson's girlfriend, what she's documenting, what she's measuring, what she's decided to make public about her body and her protocols, and the particular version of optimization she's chosen to build her life around. That story landed the way it was meant to land, with genuine weight. A real person, a real choice, a real set of questions about where biohacking ends and something harder to name begins. But the Rochester data does something to that story, because what Johnson's girlfriend is building, and what Johnson himself has built publicly, expensively, exhaustively, raises a question the biology won't answer on its own. The protocols can be identical. The biomarkers can trend in the right direction, and the body will still register. At some level, the instruments haven't fully mapped yet whether the person inside it is doing this out of genuine appetite or out of a fear that stops the moment the audience disappears. That distinction isn't small. 31% says it isn't small. There's a principle in the study of human energy systems, examined seriously in the context of psychoneuroimmunology and autonomic research, in the literature on coherent versus incoherent HRV states, sometimes described as the law of vibration. The idea is structural, not spiritual. The internal frequency you're operating at, meaning the emotional and motivational signal running underneath your behavior, shapes the biological response to that behavior. Not symbolically, measurably. The Rochester study didn't use that language, but they measured the phenomenon. And nested inside, that is what the research on intrinsic motivation keeps arriving at from a different angle. That what you're moving toward, and whether you actually want it for reasons that belong only to you, changes the trajectory. Not eventually, immediately. At the cellular level, in the inflammatory markers, in the coherence of the autonomic signal the body is generating while you sleep. This is the part the longevity industry tends to skip. It can sell the protocol. It can't sell the interior. Right now, at the end of this hour, your body has a temperature. The room you're in has a specific quality of air, close or open, warm or held. You've been receiving information, which means your nervous system has been making decisions about what to do with it. File it, discharge it, carry it forward, let it go. The question worth sitting with, not performing, not answering for an audience, is whether the optimization you're currently running feels like appetite or like defense. Whether you're building towards something that expands when you're alone with it, or managing something that only makes sense when someone else is in the room. You don't have to answer that now, but your body already knows. It's been answering it in the biomarkers the whole time. The longevity headlines will keep arriving. Johnson's girlfriend will keep documenting. The science will keep producing numbers, some solid, some overstated, all of it requiring translation before it's safe to swallow whole. None of that is stopping. What this hour has been doing is something the news cycle doesn't do on its own, reporting the story, giving it the weight it actually carries, and then giving you the ground to receive it from. You finished this video with something the Rochester researchers measured but couldn't fully explain. The specific advantage that belongs to a person doing something for a reason that belongs only to them. Not because they're afraid of what happens if they stop, because they want to know what they're capable of. That posture is not a motivational instruction. It's a biological variable, and you can choose to carry it forward or not. That choice is yours right now, intact, with no countdown running. The number was 29. 29 years old. The biological age measured in Bryan Johnson's arteries when the rest of him was 45. You heard it, and it didn't mean anything yet. It floated in front of you, slightly unreal, the way a temperature reads on a hospital wall thermometer before you understand whose body it came from. A cold number, delivered without ceremony, no larger than a blood pressure reading on a clipboard. Now you know whose body it came from. You've been inside the protocol. Not physically, but close enough to feel its texture. The sleep titration that begins before most people have set an alarm. The dietary precision calibrated to the decimal. The photobiomodulation sessions in a room that carries a faint smell of ozone and rubber tubing, where the light hits tissue at wavelengths chosen by committee. The daily stack of measurements that starts before the sun clears the horizon and doesn't stop until the body does. You've moved through all of that, and somewhere in the middle of it, the number began to carry weight it didn't have at the start. But there's a room the instruments don't enter. Researchers at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus have spent years mapping how arterial stiffness corresponds to biological age, publishing in Hypertension, in the Journal of Applied Physiology, charting the terrain with the kind of precision that doesn't leave room for sentiment. The data holds. The interventions produce real, measurable change in real, measurable tissue. Vessel elasticity response. Epigenetic signatures shift. Inflammatory markers move in the direction the protocols predict. None of that is in question. What's in question is what you're doing at 5 in the morning when no device is sampling you. The cold tile under bare feet before the house is warmed. The particular quality of your own breathing in the hallway before the monitoring app has loaded. The low, continuous signal you emit in the hours between measurements. Not your heart rate, not your cortisol, but your orientation. The barely audible frequency you broadcast into a room that contains only you. No electrode placed on skin has been calibrated to read it. And yet the science of interoception, work emerging from places like the Predictive Brain Lab at Radboud University, studies on how the brain's prior states shape what the body actually does with input, keeps arriving at the same uncomfortable suggestion. What you carry into the protocol shapes what the protocol returns. Not as metaphor, as mechanism. The instruments are getting better. They're catching things that were invisible a decade ago. Wearables now sample continuously what used to require a clinical visit. AI is beginning to read patterns in the data that trained physicians miss. None of that changes what exists in the space between the readings. The 18 seconds you spend looking at the bathroom mirror before beginning. The private verdict you deliver about what your body is capable of, the frequency at which you hold, without an audience, your actual belief about what's still possible for you. 29. It stays in the room with you differently now. Because the thing the number cannot tell you is whether Bryan Johnson feels what you feel when the house is quiet and the metrics have stopped running and there is no readout to consult. The instruments don't reach that depth. They never have. And the proof of concept, genuinely useful, genuinely remarkable, was generated by a man whose internal environment is supported by resources that represent one end of a very long spectrum. The inspiration is real. The distance is also real. And the distance is not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is the gap between what can be measured and what is actually happening inside you when no one is watching. Not a flaw in the science, not something a better assay will eventually close. A space that belongs entirely to what you believe at a low and continuous frequency about what your body is still writing, what trajectory you're actually on beneath all the information you consume about trajectories. The word coming out of interoception research keeps finding the same thing. The brain's predictions about the body's interior shape what the body does next. The prior matters. The signal you're sustaining right now, without ceremony, without an audience, without a measurement being taken. That signal is also an input. The number that opened this was cold, uncontextualized. It sat in the air and meant nothing yet. Now it has weight. It has the story of a man who looked at the data and decided to become the experiment. It has a movement forming around that decision. The quiet, accelerating conviction that the body is not fixed, that the clock is negotiable, that biology responds to inputs the way a frequency responds to a tuning fork. It has the texture of a room that smells of ozone and rubber tubing, and the texture of a hallway at 5 in the morning, tile cold through the soles of your feet, the day not yet measured, everything's still possible. It still doesn't have your number in it. Not the one your doctor orders every few years. The one your body is writing right now. In the duration of your exhale, in what you silently expect when you wake up in the unmonitored hour before the protocol begins. That measurement hasn't been taken. The instruments aren't built for it yet. Maybe they won't be. Stand in the hallway. Feel the tile. Notice what frequency you're already running. That's the experiment that's actually underway.